You're the smart one?
No, I'm the big one.
Everyone knows Sammy Schilt as one of the best and most successful kickboxers in history, a 4-time K1 Grand Prix champion and the only one who was able to finish the career of the transporter, because after the fight with Schilt, even Stetham had to look for a new job and he went to mechanics. The career of the Dutch Hightower in MMA was of course not so sublime, but there were also enough significant and bright events in it. If in the kick his height and length of the limbs always gave him an advantage and the ability to hit low kicks to the head, then in MMA it was because of his height that it was easier to take him down. Therefore he suffered most of his defeats precisely on the ground. Schilt fought non-stop for 3 years in Pancrase, where he earned a record of 10-8, and only in June 1999 he found himself in the den of a competitor, the rings. It was a special fight according to special rules with a special opponent. Gilbert Yvel won 40 fights in his career and didn't bring any of them to the decision of the judges. Schilt came out with his bare fists and hit only with his palms, as he used to do in Pancrase, and Gilbert was in shin guards and stroked the skyscraper with all his might with his mighty knuckles. Gilbert, as a true gentleman, didn't even let Schilt know that it was time to fight, and having flown right at him with a gong, knocked him down. In this fight, Sammy constantly clenched. He tried to break Yvel's body with his knees and threw slaps on him with his palm, which didn't cause visible damage but only turned on the hurricane and pushed him to feet. Yvel performed an excellent combo, after which Schilt was already on autopilot trying to grab Yvel's leg to survive the fight. The referee, having counted the knockdown, continued the fight, but the next fall on the canvas for Schilt was the last in this fight. The battle was stopped and Hurricane won a bright and spectacular victory in this battle, although as for me, with the same rules he had a clear advantage which he used perfectly. The fiasco with Yvel shocked Schilt, and returning to Pancrase he had 5 wins, 4 of them ahead of time, and then resigned to fight in the rings. This time his opponent was the judoka and pro wrestler Yoshihisa Yamamoto, who has won none of the last 4 fights. True, this time Sammy didn't hesitate and also went to the duel in gloves, so the Japanese had a hard night. The fighters didn't force events, and the first minutes passed in reconnaissance and shooting low kicks. The Japanese fighter eagerly looked at Schilt's body, imagining how to get close and throw the giant onto the canvas, thereby increasing his chances of winning. Soon Yamamoto was on the ground, though not in the way he had dreamed of. Flying into a knockdown was clearly not part of his plans. At the 3rd minute, Schilt gave a clear combination that would have ended perfectly with a soccer kick, but apparently the rings rules were a little more humane than the Pride ones, because there was no soccer finish, but the Japanese was already ready without it. Having performed once again in Pancrase, Sammy went to Netherlands for the It's Showtime tournament, where he got one of the most uncompromising grunts of the 90s, Bob Schreiber. It was not for nothing that they called him terrible, since Bob turned every fight into a bloodbath, and he went to this fight with a stepladder, arranging one of the most epic stare-downs in the history of martial arts. The fighters at the very first second staged a brutal exchange and Bob killed Schilt with a left hook, but the rules of the organization didn't allow Schreiber to finish the massacre of the opponent, and the referee, having counted the knockdown, resumed the fight in a standing position. Later, Sammy seized the initiative and constantly entering the clinch he destroyed and smashed Bob with his knees, forcing Schreiber to turn on his head and fight back with everything he could.
A knee thrown by the 125 kilogram.
One of the knees went right into the beard and Schreiber collapsed, but in order to stop Schreiber you need to knock out Schreiber. So after recovering, Bob went on boarding, arranging exchange after exchange until the very end of the round. It was a pure 5 minutes of open brawling that didn't even have a hint of any kind of game plan, and if there was one, it was just to chop down your opponent. At the beginning of the second round, the fight was still over. Schilt held a guillotine in a stance and Borg grabbed the ropes, which was a signal for the referee, who intervened and stopped the fight. Sammy won and soon received an invitation to UFC. He performed at the UFC 31 tournament. This is a historically important event where all weight classes took on their current shape, and Dana White personally called it one of the most spectacular and interesting cards in the history of his promotion. The debut of BJ Penn, the knockouts of Shawnee Carter and Chuck Liddell, the most popular bulldog choke in MMA history from Carlos Newton, and for a snack the 5-round war of Pedro Rizzo and Randy Couture, which was recognized as the fight of the year. So Sammy also didn't disappoint the boss, and together with Pete Williams played a good movie. Pete takes Sammy to the ground at the first minute, but there was one unpleasant surprise waiting for him. Schilt snapped Dutch-made handcuffs around Pete's wrists and allowed him to remain silent for about 2 minutes. During this time, Pete was not able to hit him even once, and John McCarthy's powers to stop the fight and raise the fighters to the stance were still limited, so the illegally arrested Pete suffered for a very long time and couldn't do anything. Schilt countered Pete's jab and after another tight front, laid down the opponent with his left. After that, John McCarthy reacts and stopped the raging giant. So the first fight in the UFC for Sammy was very successful, an excellent performance and a knockout at the second minute of the second round, but Pete Williams, having lost 2 more fights in the UFC, ended his career and hung up his gloves on a nail. MMA has become an increasingly popular sport, which has attracted many famous people in show business and cinema. So at the UFC 32 tournament, the well-known Carmen Electra confessed her love for MMA and told how she likes to watch the fights of sweaty men in a cage. Well, immediately after Carmen's confession, Sammy Schilt and Josh Barnett entered the cage. Josh was only on his way to the title of the youngest heavyweight champion of the UFC, and at the last tournament he seriously stumbled over the fist of Pedro Rizzo, flying into a beautiful knockout. Very first approach, and Josh after mid-kick takes Sammy down. Getting caught in the canvas with Barnett is not the most promising idea. Josh takes side control and soon gets into the mount, and keeping Schilt on the canvas begins methodical punching. Even lying on his back, Sammy managed to respond and cut Josh, who also didn't remain in debt, and by the end of the round, 2 of the 3 faces in the octagon were broken and covered in blood. Josh, who performed the armbar from any position and in any state, managed to catch Schilt for the submission and made the Hightower tap. So in this fight, which became the last for Schilt in UFC, the victory remained with Barnett, and 2 years later there was a rematch at the Inoki Bombardier tournament. This time the fight lasted a little longer, namely until the 3rd round, but the result was the same, an armbar from Josh and a beautiful victory that put an end to the dilogy of the 2 eminent fighters. At the Pride 21 tournament, Hightower went into battle against promotion newcomer Fedor Emelianenko, who, having beaten everyone in the rings, went on promotion and arrived in Pride. Some sources said that Fedor could get a title shot right away, but the rules of the rings and Pride were very different, so he decided to have an intermediate fight, and his opponent was Sammy, who was in a good mood. Fedor at the very first seconds brought Sammy down and kept him on the canvas for the entire first round, breaking from various positions and mixing it all with attempts to finish the fight with a submission. The second and third rounds differed very little from the first, and everything was done in a similar way. Transfer to the ground and dominating control from Fedor, who confidently took the fight by unanimous decision of the judges and issued Schilt the first defeat in Pride. This fiasco slightly spoiled the balance of Schilt, who was counting on getting the title against the champion Nogueira, but because of this defeat to Fedor, this fight lost its champion status and took place at the Pride 23 tournament. But as for the champion himself, he only walked away after thrashing from Bob Sapp, from whom he snatched the victory and made a comeback, and his total series consisted out of 11 wins in a row.
The same thing, but he doesn't want to walk into a knee, because that's one thing that Bob Sapp had.
For Nogueira to get Sammy down proved to be a problem, and the first attempts were unsuccessful. When the Minotauro managed to pull Shilt to the ground, Sammy threw a couple of blobs on him and immediately got to his feet, fearing Antonio's dangerous jiu-jitsu, and this wasn't for no reason. Nogueira still took Sammy down, and when trying the armbar lost his position but managed to throw a triangle around Shilt's neck in time. Sammy resisted a little, but Antonio's triangle worked like a bear trap. Either you tap or you're left without a head. Sammy chose the first option and tapped, thereby losing the second fight in a row, but we have to admit that he lost to the two best heavyweights of his time, so it's not bad at all. In 2004, the Pride hosted the heavyweight Grand Prix with the participation of the best fighters of the division. Sammy was also included in the tournament. At the first stage, he got the Giant with the nickname The Giant, Gun McGee. A year earlier, McGee fought for the UFC belt, but after that fiasco in a fight with Tim Sylvia, he left the organization and came to try his hand in Japan. And his overall record was 12 wins and 2 losses to Sylvia and Barnett.
Let's hope, boss, that they go longer than 414 and 404, and right away there's a shot. There's a double leg.
The very first pass to the legs ended in success for the Giant. He moved Sammy down and took a full mount, from where hammer fists of varying severity rained down, but it was Shilt who first bled, breaking the nose of the Giant lying on his back.
The armbar, Shilt. Salient point delivered, and it's over. Extends the...
McGee tried to attack the leg, but Sammy came to the armbar and submitted the Giant at the beginning of the 6th minute of the first round. Thus, Shilt advanced to the next stage of the tournament, and Gun McGee left Japan with a record of 0-2, although he was at the top of his division at UFC. So for another UFC fighter, the Japanese stuntmen were too tough. Someone like Chuck Liddell understood sad feelings of the Giant, since a year earlier he himself came to Pride as the strongest middle and light heavyweight in the world, according to Dana White, but was destroyed by Rampage and sent back to America in upset feelings. At the second stage, Shilt got a more serious opponent. That was Sergey Kharitonov, who at the first stage also dismantled Morilla Ninja Hua, who had pretty much gained weight. So there was only room for one blonde in the semi-finals.
Sergey Kharitonov squaring around. No knows where the advantage will be.
Oh, and another left, 2 lefts, and trust me,
Shilt hit a couple of power jabs to Sergey's head and then pulled him to the ground. Most of the time, Kharitonov controlled Sammy and worked from above, and then went to the full mount, and from this position for 2 minutes he slowly hammered weighty hammer fists into the opponent's head. When Shilt's entire face was covered in blood and he couldn't get out of this unpleasant situation, the referee couldn't stand it and intervened, stopping Kharitonov. So Kharitonov finished the second opponent in a row and went further down the grid. But for Sammy Schilt, the tournament came to an end. Moreover, this fight was his last performance in Pride. Schilt parted ways with Pride and he focused on K1, where he won the Grand Prix 3 times in a row in 2005, 6 and 7, and he became the only fighter who managed to do this 3 years in a row. This was Sammy Shilt's career in MMA, who closed it with an overall record of 26 wins, 14 losses and 1 draw. In MMA, though, he didn't achieve the greatness and respect that he had in K1, but he also included his name in history as a fighter who was always ready to give a fight to anyone and whose fights were always interesting to watch. That's gonna be it for today, my friends. Leave likes, subscribe to the channel, and don't forget about the bell so as not to miss new videos. See you all soon.